Hello, I'm Dr. Chris Zimmer, and I want to do a follow-up video from the last one entitled Don't Forget About 7/2/2024. The reason I bring that up is because if we do indeed have a rapture on July 1st, then there have to be 2 days present in the world, 7/1 and 7/2. I'm in the United States, so if it takes place on 7/1, then that means just across the international date line, it'll be 7/2. And that would be in places like the Far East, Japan, Oceania, which includes Australia, and so on. So 2 days in the world, July 1st, July 2nd, if we do indeed have a rapture on that July 1st date. And throwing up a few more numbers here because I found some interesting correlation. If we look at 7/1/24 and you add up the numbers from that, that's just a truncated version of the first date. You get a 14, and that's deliverance. And if we go to the 7/2 date and do the truncated, we get 15, which is rest. And 7/1/2024, if we use the full year, we get 16, which is love or loving. And if we go to 7/2 with the full year, we get 17, which is victory over the enemy. And in a moment, I'm going to show you some correlation to the Apollo program where we'll see some of these same numbers. But first, in the news, we've had a lot about earthquakes. There has been a strong earthquake which triggered a tsunami warning in Arequipa, Peru, which is nicknamed the White City and Lion of the South. It has been home to many Christian houses of worship, past and present, including from left to right, the Basilica Cathedral Arequipa, Monastery of Santa Catalina, and Church of La Campana, just to name a few. And a powerful earthquake struck near the coast of Peru early Friday, triggering a tsunami warning for the region, injuring at least 5 people. There's that 5, the number of grace, and we see it in a lot of different places on these recent stories. According to the country's health ministry, the 7.2 magnitude quake hit just outside Peru's second most populated city, Arequipa, at approximately 12:36 a.m. local time, the strongest in that part of Peru in over 23 years. And I think this was just about 6 miles or so west of just outside Arequipa. And the event prompted the country's national tsunami warning, which now has been lifted. And let's just cut through and go down a little bit further here. 2 smaller aftershocks between 4.4 and 4.9 magnitude were recorded by the USGS. There were reports from local officials of damage to houses and buildings, but no fatalities, according to Reuters. And if we take that time and we look at it in Strong's 1236, that means lead a life or living. And it's very interesting that with all these churches, it sounds like this whole area is a very Christian area, that they were somewhat protected from that huge quake, 7.2. And that 7.2 directs us to the second day of the rapture, and we're going to see that theme not only here, but in a couple of other places as well that I'll show you in just a moment. And the 2 smaller aftershocks, the 4.4, there's our Strong's 44, the fishing hook, or, leading to that theme of a fishing trip. And there is a connection, I believe, to the 2019 Ridgecrest earthquakes in California. And this map shows you where it is out in the desert. It's near Death Valley. The 2019 Ridgecrest earthquakes were a sequence of July 4th and 5th quakes which occurred north to northeast of the town of Ridgecrest, California and Kern County. And the magnitude 5.4 and magnitude 7.1 quakes struck on Friday, July 5th at 4:08 a.m. and 8:19 p.m. and approximately 6 miles to the northwest. And this 408, there's that theme of the eclipse that we just had on 4/8 this year, and also the 8/19. There's that number that's the sum of 666 and 153. So these are interesting numbers. They're right on the money. And if we go from 7/5/2019, the day of the 7.1 quake, because if you remember, we had a 7.2 in the last one, a recent one, so we can make a correlation. 7/5, that was the date in 2019. If we count to 6/28/2024, well, that's 4 years, 11 months, 23 days, or 260 weeks. And that's, let's just call it 5 years. Strong's G260 together, and if we put the two together, if we put the Ridgecrest and the Arequipa quakes together, we get a 7.1 and a 7.2 earthquake about 5 years apart. So this is interesting. This seems to be pointing towards the 2 days of the prospective rapture. Then we had a 3.4 magnitude earthquake shaking upstate New York, which is rather unusual, in the Syracuse area, and that was on June 28th. And it says a 3.4 magnitude earthquake shook parts of upstate New York, Syracuse area around 11:45 p.m., 3:45 UTC. It was centered on Lake Ontario, about 9 miles. There's that number 9, which is a number of completion. And then it says in April, it brings our attention back to that eclipse where we had 4.8 magnitude earthquake, and I think we had one on the west side of the country as well. So all these numbers seem to be lining up for a soon rapture. And that 3.4 magnitude earthquake, I think that's speaking to what we investigated before with the 3, I think it's the Gimel and the Dalet, 3, 4, 3 going to 4, which was the year, this year, on the Hebrew calendar, and also on the 2023 going into 2024. And the imagery is that of a man walking towards a door. We also had a 5.0 earthquake near Atka, Alaska, and this was on June 29th, 11:10 UTC. And the name Atka, I couldn't find it anywhere else other than exploring baby names, but it's commonly a female name from the Greek origin that means kind and good. Also means the 5 is the number of grace, too. Okay, so something interesting. Let's go way back to the X-15, which is the NASA's Mach 6.7 hypersonic aircraft. And if you notice here, one of the vehicles had 66671 as its tail number. And that's, I don't know what the connection would be, but I find the number very interesting, that it's possibly, foretelling of the 666 on July 1st if we do have a rapture at the same time. The X-15 powered by the XLR-99 engine set a record for speed, Mach 6.7, and altitude, 67 miles in the 1960s, and it still holds that airspeed record nearly 60 years after it was set. And this Mach 6.7 is about 4,520 miles per hour. And just a little bit more about the X-15. Flights of the X-15, the experimental space plane, built by North American Aviation, used by USAF and NASA, were conducted from 1959 to 1968. There are a total of 12 pilots that flew 3 X-15 space planes, flying record high-altitude flights, and one of them was Neil Armstrong, to later walk on the moon. 5 principal aircraft were used for the X-15 program, the 3 X-15 space planes, and then 2 modified B-52 bombers called NB-52s. The interesting part here, I think, is in the numbers, the tail numbers on the X-15. The tail numbers 66670, 66671, and then 66672. And the X-15-3, the 153, like in the 153 Big Fish, was flown by Neil Armstrong. So we've got some imagery here of the Beast, the 666, both on 7.1 and 7.2, which would be the prospective dates of the rapture, and 153 Big Fish. So kind of strange. God works in strange ways, and it sounds like he's working right here. And if we go to the beginning of the Apollo space program, where they were testing the capsules. Actually, this was Mercury and Apollo. The Little Joe was a solid fuel booster rocket used by NASA for 8 launches from 59 to 61. And in this one, they tested the Project Mercury capsules as well as the name given to the test program using the booster. And they were testing all sorts of things. They were testing the escape system and so on and so forth. But I thought in this case, the Little Joe had a burn time. This is the booster stage of 1.53 seconds. There's that 153 big fish. And if we go to the Little Joe 2, which was used for the Apollo capsules, this was tested from 63 to 66. And they wanted to verify the parachute recovery system and so on, and the launch escape system and all that. And the booster in this case was the same number, 1.53 seconds. So here again we have this 153 big fish, even in the Little Joe 2. And this was a tragedy. This was the start of the Apollo program. The first, I believe it's the first manned flight where they had Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee sitting on the launch pad, and this was LC-34, which is Launch Complex 34, and there was an accident. They started pumping pure oxygen into the capsule, and there was a lot of flammable material. They didn't know that this would happen. They thought it was going to be a safe test, but some short in the wiring ignited this, and it caused a flash fire that pressurized the cabin. And they had to complicate matters, they had a door or a hatch that was a 3-piece hatch, which was actually bolted shut, and it closed from the inside, not from the outside. So if you had any pressure inside the capsule, of course, it would press or seal the hatch against the frame, and there was no way to remove it under high pressure, and that's exactly what happened. Anyway, all 3 were killed, and that stands as a testament to the Apollo program and the getting the safety right, I guess. Anyway, it was destroyed on January 27th, 1967 at 23:31:19 UTC. And if we correlate that to Strong's G2331 is Thessalonians, and of course that immediately makes us think of 1 Thessalonians 4:15 through 17, the rapture verses. For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will by no means precede those who are asleep, for the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall always be with the Lord. So it's interesting that this, something really good came out of it. It clues us in about the rapture, and that the Apollo program might somehow have some clues to that. So if we look at a number of the Apollo missions, I didn't list them all here because there are quite a few more that were unmanned where they did a lot of tests. But the main ones, AS-202 was one of the first ones, using a Saturn 1B on that LC-34 launch pad. And we've got that 202 imagery here. We've got the 55, which represents Revelation 5:5, and that's Jesus, where he appears in heaven and he's worthy to open the seals. And then we have 125, which represents the church, or it also represents Revelation 12:5, the child caught up. And then 22, of course, is the last chapter of the book, which relates to the end, and it's also a description of heaven. So this seems to say Jesus plus the church plus heaven, and that gives us the number 202. And let's see here. If we go to that Apollo 1, I believe that was the first crewed mission, which was planned for February 21st, 1967. Naturally, that was canceled because the test failed. Let's see, that has SA-204. Saturn Apollo 204, which is it names the launch vehicle, and this was the Saturn 1B. Anyway, we have that imagery. 204 actually gives us a 20, but it also gives us a 24. So it seems to be pointing toward 2024, excuse me. And if we go on to Apollo 5, the number of grace and all that, this was a non-crewed mission, but it carried the same number because the Apollo 1 mission failed, so they gave Apollo 5 the SA-204. So it seems we have two instances of 204 or 24, kind of pointing to the year. But that took off on a different launch pad. That was LC-37B. They did not use LC-34 again until Apollo 7, and they did not crew a launch until Apollo 7. So there was a big gap in between that terrible mishap of Apollo 1 and Apollo 7. So it seems to be kind of bookending the numbers 7 and 1, just like the Rapture that we're looking at this year, July 1st. And both of those were on LC-34 launch pad, and this was Apollo 7 was the last time that LC-34 was used. Apollo 7 was the fifth Saturn 1B flown, and again, there's that 5, the number of grace, the first crewed space flight since Apollo 1. Okay, so we've got a 7-1 theme, and there's even a 24 in there, or possible 2024. And then Apollo 8 was the next crewed mission, and this now used the Saturn V, and they went to LC-39A to launch this. And these were the first astronauts to orbit the moon. So now we've got another, landmark occurrence with the Apollo 8 now that seems to be bookmarking something else now. We've got Apollo 8, and then the next one, Apollo 11, is the first, carried the first astronauts, of course, to walk on the moon. And now we have the numbers 8-11, and that 8-11, I believe, points to the world population at the time of the rapture, and that's exactly what it is right now. If you do not round up the numbers, you still have an 8.11 billion world population. And these now were launches with the Saturn V. And again, we've got that theme of 5 and grace. Let's see, what else we got here? Oh, there was a bit of a problem on Apollo 11. When they got the LEM down, they had an alarm code on the guidance computer, 1202, and they kept calling back to try to figure out what 1202 was. And it turned out that they were giving the computer so much information it was overloading it, but it was intermittent. So they were able to, just leave it the way it was. And Neil Armstrong was, I believe he was the one that landed it manually without using the computer. So you had a 1202, and that's one with the 202 in it. So we've got that 202 theme again. And just to restate, 34 could mean 3 to 4, may symbolize the Gimel Dalet, the image of a man walking towards a door. It also may speak something about that door hatch that will close after the rapture. And since there was a fire, is that indicating that, is this prophetic in some way, that perhaps when the rapture happens, there will be some sort of nuclear exchange? People have been talking about that, so that's one possibility. It may also symbolize the Holy Trinity, which is 3, and the Trinity plus the Church, 1 additional, so we have 4, 3 going to 4. So some interesting numbers there. All right. Now, if we look at the last missions, Apollo 12 through 17, Apollo 12 is the symbol of God's power and authority. And again, this is Saturn V. In fact, all these launches, all the way up to the very last one, 17, are used with a Saturn V rocket. And these all take off from LC-39A. So Apollo 13 was the only unsuccessful. They had an explosion with 2 oxygen tanks when they tried to stir them up. This was on the service module, and it rendered it useless. So they had to use the LEM again for life support, and then the command module could only now be used for re-entry. So we have 12, and then we had 13, and Apollo 14 was crewed, and 14, of course, is Deliverance. That was the Saturn V. 5 again, Grace. And now something interesting starts to happen. Starting with 14, we have launches in 1971, and then Apollo 15, of course 15 is Rest, and this is another Saturn V, and this is launched on July 30th, 1971. And then with Apollo 16, which is Love and Loving, that number in the Bible that is launched in 1972. So now we're bleeding over from 1971 into 1972. And Apollo 17 is the 11th and final mission of the Apollo program, the 6th mission where Apollo astronauts set foot on the moon. And this one takes place December 11th, 1972. So we have the last 4 Apollo program flights were in 71 and 72, and it will be 71 and 72 in the world in 2024 during the prospective rapture. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that's pointing to that, but I'm not going to promise anything. I'm just saying that, we have 4 scriptures now that are saying it, and I'll go into those in just a moment. But anyway, the Apollo program, it seems like the numbers are, pointing to the rapture, 71, 72. Anyway, we'll see. I think there was even an 1111 here somewhere, but I can't spot it. Oh, well. Okay, so I think there was an 1111, but I don't see it. All right, so Old Testament, New Testament, there are 2 books in the Old Testament that look like they have the date of the rapture, Psalms and Micah, and 2 in the New, John and Luke. And they seem to have 7/1/2024 in there. So Psalm 71, 24 verses, 2 verses that it starts off with, 2 and 4, that begin with deliver me. So we have a 24, and then at the very end we have 20 that starts to speak, rapture speak, bring me up again from the depths of the earth, someone going up, and then 24, for they are brought to shame who seek my hurt. Why are they shamed? Because they were left behind. So this is rapture speak again. So I noticed that this is reminiscent of 5:24:24, which pointed to 3:11 on the Hebrew, which is a delay, and 24 is mentioned here twice as well. If we add 24 days to 7:1, in like manner, we arrive at 7:25, and then strong 7:25, of course, is harpagmos or rapture. And then in Micah 7, again, rapture speak in verse 1, they have gathered the summer fruits, and then the good man is perished or taken out of the earth. This is rapture speak again in 2, and then in 4, it talks about that day of the rapture, the day of thy watchman, and thy visitation cometh. So we've got Micah 7, verses 1, 2, 4, and if we interject the 20 verses in there, we get a 20:24. Put it all together, and you get 7/1/2024. Then in John 21, we have verse 1 is just the setup. It's talking about where this is, Sea of Tiberias and all that. And then in verse 2, it talks about, or names the disciples that are present, 7 disciples total. And then Simon Peter in verse 3 is saying, I'm going fishing. So this is talking about the fishing trip. And then in verse 4, we're back to talking about who is present. And Jesus is one person, and he's standing on the shore. So you've got 7 disciples. Jesus is one in verses 2 and 4, and they're going fishing. So we've got 7/1/24. And then finally, Luke 17. Of course, we had the 2 11s, which alludes to a robbery taking place. And who's getting robbed? Well, in the acrostic, it's Strong's 4567, which is Satan. So Satan's getting robbed. And in verse 37, it says, "And they answered and said to him, 'Where, Lord?' So he said to them, 'Wherever the body is, there the eagles will be gathered together.'" And to kind of sort this out, you have to know that Jesus appointed 70 disciples to go out and preach just a little bit before this in Luke 10:1. So this makes a total of 71 disciples, including himself. And if we put Luke 17 of course means complete victory, overcoming the enemy. And then 71 is the prospective date of the rapture. So we have 1771, and we found that number in pi. So that also corresponds to rapture speak. So, and also the other date was here too, the 5-2, and then two men and 2 men is 4, so 5-2-4-24, and then 5-20-24, of course, was a delay, and then 7-1-24 is here as well. Okay, and I added just a little bit to this because we're looking at 2 days, and I don't want to forget about 7-2, because naturally, if 7-1 is in the world and the rapture occurs on that day in the U.S., then just across the international date line, it should be 7-2. So there'll be 2 dates in the world. So if we look up 7, which is the Holy Spirit, or 7 spirits of God, and then we look Father, Yahweh, the number of his name is 26, if we add that up. And if we look in Strong's, Hebrew 1 is Father, but it's also Father in Hebrew 2. So we've got H1 and H2 are both Father. And then, of course, in the Son, we have the time, H853, the Aleph Tav. If you add it together, you get 23. He's the bright and morning star, AM, so we have 8:53:23 AM. And this, I believe, was confirmed by the Venus being occulted by the moon on 4/7 this year at 8:53:23 AM Mountain Standard Time. Okay, and I already showed this in the previous video. We have a CVN 71, which was the Roosevelt, and we also had the Reagan. They were doing joint Pacific Valiant Shield drills, and this story was put out on June 10th. But I wanted to point to each of the Nimitz-class aircraft carriers can carry around 60 airframes. So you had 2 aircraft carriers capable of carrying 60 airframes. Well, I was watching some advertisements for a charity called the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, and I noticed that it's the common year, 771 Israel, which is counting 365-day years, which is in the prefix to the phone number there. But we also had 8448, which were some interesting numbers. That showed up in pi, and it was an instruction to add 84 days to 48 this year, which takes you to 71. But we also had a 6868, which is CVN 68 is the Nimitz, and 4884 is the suffix in the lower right there, and that is synarpazo. That's another word for harpazo, another word for rapture. And then finally, I got the full number. I didn't see this before, so I put that in there for that suffix of 6060. I've got the complete phone number now. And the 6060, I think that ties somehow to the aircraft carriers. Maybe that's somebody had a dream, I think it was, where they had I think it was a cabin girl, who had a dream about seeing those aircraft carriers either being in the Middle East or doing drills or something like that right around the time of the rapture. So it's interesting how this is pulling together, and I don't know if there's anything further that's going to happen with those 2 aircraft carriers, but they were in the news. Okay, so how many estimated to be raptured? Last year we did some numbers when it was 8.10 billion, and 1.44 looked like they were going to leave, and 6.66 billion left behind. Just kind of a fun calculation to make. And then Pastor Wright's late wife Christina had a dream where 725 was there, but no one could find 811. Well, 725 was the day that Patrick had found or he discovered the child asteroid. So that's, I believe, there's a partial fulfillment of this dream. And then no one could find 811, which I believe is the, it's the rapture drops that number, 8.11 billion. So it plummets at that point. And this is the world population 629. I think that was just yesterday. And you can see without rounding, it's still 8.11, but it's projected to be 8.12 on 7.5. So if the rapture happens on 7.1 and 7.2, then it looks like this will never be realized, and it implies no more grace, because on 7.5 that number will disappear. World population drops suddenly from 8.11 billion people at the rapture. 524.24, the sun was centered on the line between Atlas and Secunda Hydatum in Taurus, and that it was at the time of 811, and that kind of ties in with this, I believe. And it says, this is 524 was a delay, and then the next one is not delayed, and the next one is 7.1. The 84-week timeline also confirmed 811 in a date and with day count pairs as well. I did not put that into this video. If you want to see the 84-week timeline and the 11 pairs that are there, 8 that I found originally and 3 new ones, then you have to go back to my previous video. Sinarpazo, and that's on 7.1, and then 7.2. I didn't put any times in here for 7.2, but if you're into U.S. or Israel, then you can see what the times would be. Also Mexico City. And I'll just throw this up here again. The Summer Olympics, I thought that was very interesting that the dates that this ranges from is 7/26, which means harpazo, and the last day would be 8/11, which looks like it will be the maximum for the world population if it drops from that on 7/1 and 7/2. So that's all I have for you. It's going to happen very soon, I think. So I'll see you in the clouds. God bless.